once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
And welcome in. Here we go. It's On the Ledger Ontario Politics podcast. And just a reminder, as we record this, it is Thursday, March the 19th. It happens to have been, this would have been my mother-in-law's birthday. So the folks around the table are thinking about her today. And she was always reminding us that it was St. Joseph's Day, and which is the day of the worker. So for whatever it's worth, people on March break and taking some time down, this is it. Around the table, Tim Hudak is here. Of course, he is the former leader of the PC party and now a partner at Council Public Affairs. Keith Leslie, our longtime political analyst at Queen's Park. John Wright is the CEO at Canada Pulse Insights, and the Honourable Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario. Just on the note, and John was regaling us with his adventures coming up, heading to Ireland to do sort of a family roots situation. And I just wanted to note, I marked St. Patrick's Day this week with a glass of Guinness and a boiled dinner. So that's pretty much no real excitement beyond that, but that's how we did it. A couple of things we want to get to. I mean, there's no shortage of stuff, oddly enough, on the March break to talk about. But I want to start with the story from the Star this week, and it comes from David Coletto and the team at Abacus, just to talk about the polls, because this will sort of inform or frame, I think, the conversation about everything else that's going on. Tim, it doesn't seem to matter what the headline says these days. The polling right now, they're off their all-time high, as David Coletto will say, 53%. That was last August. Tories right now sitting around 44%, and in any given year, a political party would just die for those numbers. So with all the steam and everything else that's going on in the news and the headline and the news cycle, the Premier's numbers a little softer than the party, but the party's very resilient despite the circumstances we find ourselves in. And any of the malaise economically, the international stories that are going on, it's an interesting balance to see how resilient the Tories are in the polls these days.
You got to give them credit, right? I mean, this is 8 years in to a mandate, and the forces of gravity usually mean that your numbers head down after your fifth year. To his credit, I mean, Doug Ford is the first Premier in Ontario's history to win 3 straight majorities with an increased share of the vote. And I know we'll talk about this, Dave, during the podcast, but, a series of different topics he's addressed in the past week, but he still has a well-calibrated, barometer of where public opinion is in his voting universe. And I think even though they're a random collection, they still seem to land. The party's also built very strong apparatus in terms of fundraising, getting the message out and keeping its foot on the throat of the opposition leaders. But man, I mean, gravity eventually does win out. So what's going to win, the immovable force of the Ford instinct or the unstoppable object of just people looking for change after some time?
Well, and we can look at that in terms of the longevity and the resilience. Kathleen Wynne, the Liberals kind of enjoyed the same sort of wave, 15 years between you and Dalton McGuinty at the helm. So it's not unprecedented. But again, it just seems to me that you guys didn't have those numbers.
No, I mean, at various times there were, but consistently, no, we didn't. And it's all great till it's not, right? So, I mean, who knows? The Premier's he's got a lot going on, and I know we're going to talk about some of these things. I think it's been a bizarre period in terms of the number of things that he's talking about, in the way that he's talking about them, and the things that are actually affecting people's lives, like whether they can find a family doctor and whether they, whether their kids are having a good experience in school, whether there's support for their child with autism. So I think there's a lot going on that he doesn't want to talk about. But yeah, I mean, he's a political wunderkind. So he's got lots of game. His personal numbers are down. And I think, he's going back into the legislature after weeks where they normally would have been in the legislature. I think it's 5 weeks that they would have been back, normally according to the calendar. So they've delayed going back, and he doesn't want to be under that headlamp in the legislature. So we'll see what happens. There are tough negotiations coming up in terms of education. There's going to be a rally on the lawn of Queen's Park about the education system and school boards and so on the 23rd. So he's got a lot that he doesn't want to talk about, and he's doing that very well. He's distracting from those things very, very well, which is keeping his numbers up. And as I say, it works till it doesn't.
John, just curious to get your take on that general trend, whether it's Abacus or others. I mean, the numbers are consistently strong.
Yeah, but you have to look at all kinds of different numbers in order to make a calculation as to whether or not a government or a leader's in good shape. So the vote numbers are sitting at around 44% in the Abacus poll. And we've seen consistently since the first election of Doug Ford that the numbers have sat around 41%. So 4 in 10 people in the province of Ontario, less so in the city of Toronto, but more so in the outlying areas, support Doug Ford's PC government. However, we also have looked at the personal numbers. And as the Premier just alluded to, I mean, his personal numbers are not great. In fact, and there are different methodologies used to calculate, but if you look at the Angus Reid Institute's latest numbers, he's sitting at 31% his personal approval, which makes him the second lowest in terms of popular approval in the country. So you could look at it that way and say that while his brand of party, which faces no significant ballot question that's being shaped by an election, nor an electoral party that could go, head to head with him, he's got a majority government, but his own personal numbers are closer to 7 and 10, almost 2/3 in certain parts of the province who don't like the way he's conducting himself. They're disapproving of that. Now, one could argue that there's other methodologies that would put him as high as 36, but his party leads who he is. So it's a different way of looking at it. But I would say right now, there are some weeks you get a little too much Doug Ford. You hear a little too much of this, and I go back to what I said many, many, many months ago, and that is Jean Chrétien was the master of this. He knew when to take himself out of the picture and go away for a while and let his ministers and others deal with this stuff. The Premier is on all kinds of issues that even as bombastic it may seem some days for him, that he's on the issues that people can rally around. But his personal numbers have taken a toll, no question about it, in the last period of time.
Keith, the remarkable thing on all of this is that when you look at the opposition numbers, where the Liberals still have not selected a new leader, they're in the low 30s, which again would be pretty good and competitive. But the NDP just cannot take advantage of the opportunity to be the leader of the opposition here, the official opposition, and that goes back to Andrea Horwath. Boy, and then you look at the NDP federally. I don't know if this actually, if you can translate or pull the thread through from one to the other. I suppose the federal NDP would love to have the provincial numbers, but at this stage, this is a real problem for the NDP.
Absolutely. Just as much as the Ontario Liberals without a leader are benefiting from the popularity of Prime Minister Mark Carney, the Ontario NDP, despite a pretty strong performance overall by Styles, is not getting any numbers or any respect in the population. I think it's because the disaster, it appears to me, of the federal NDP leadership race is just drawing no one into that party at all, and they're not at all helping the provincial NDP. Of course, and there's very little separation between the two, unlike most other parties, provincially and federally. The NDP, there's not a lot of separation there. So I think this is a real issue for them. I think for Doug Ford, of course, and Premier Wynne hit it on the head, it's so much easier to be a premier at a podium instead of in the legislature. And at the podium, he can make so many pronouncements. And, he's got his topic of the day, and then day, as you like to say, on an unrelated topic or at a news conference on another event. He's pulling up 3 and 4 things at a time nowadays. And maybe to John's point, maybe it's time he went away, but it's working for him. I think it keeps him front and center. it makes it that much harder for the opposition to get any attention at all from the media, to get any play. They're putting, they post up their own Instagram posts and Facebook reactions, but it's not the same. As a premier at a podium getting full camera time and taking every issue under the sun. And then, as I say, jumping on some of them and taking it too far almost at some point. He should have shot him again. I know we'll get to that, but the premier, he can't, sometimes I think he's his own worst enemy when he goes a little bit too far. But for the most part, to this idea that Tim says that he's got his thumb on how a lot of people feel about a lot of issues, he's right. He maybe shouldn't express that opinion sometimes, a little too populist, but he does seem to know what a lot of people are thinking, and it works for him. It keeps those numbers for him and the PC party very high. And I know that he's less popular than the party right now, but I think the two are very closely tied, and I think he really is the party in most people's minds.
So let me ask you then, Keith, because, I'm hearing reporters, I heard Brian Lilly talking about this, reporters at the Scrum, or they're at the news event where he's making his, scheduled announcement, starts talking about several other things. There seems to be a lot of flack in the air in as much as there are 3 or 4 things that come out of a news conference. And then all of a sudden the reporters are walking away thinking, okay, what story are we actually going to do here? And it sounds funny, but at the same time, it really it divides and conquers in terms of messaging. I don't know if it's strategy or not, but I think it's very clever.
Well, it works, and he ends up getting 2 stories or 3 stories sometimes. He'll get the main event covered. He'll get the comment on the court case that he shouldn't have commented. That'll get a story for him. He's very good at getting ink. And as you say, going way off topic, all of a sudden we're talking about pepper spray. Wait, we were at a housing announcement or something. We were at a corrections announcement. He can go way off on any topic and still somehow, as you say, it detracts from the main message, but he still ends up getting that main message out there. And the side issues as well. He manages to insert himself in virtually every story. One reporter yesterday, I couldn't believe this, asked him about his position on the Strait of Hormuz and the Iraq or the Iran war. And I thought, come on, we've got enough going on with this guy right now. Do we really need to drag him into that? But that's the sort of issues, because you never know what he's going to say. Reporters will pose anything up to him because he could tee off on anything and give you another story.
Yeah, well, and so last week, we went on, and I just wanted to point out, I thought that your exchange, Kathleen and John, over the education and trustees was vital and vigorous, and I got a lot of feedback. That was a great conversation. It was awesome. So it was great. But here's the interesting thing, and again, we record this on Thursdays, and as I point out, things may have changed. To me, the next day, the Friday, was the ultimate Friday dump. This was the Friday before March break, and the minister, whom I'll admit I'm not, acquainted with, Stephen Crawford. He's the Minister of Public and Business Service Delivery and Procurement. I'm thinking this is the guy who's in charge of actually getting new business cards for everybody, because he's going to need 2 just to get his name and title on each one of them. But he's the guy that came out and told us all that it was necessary, vital, that we see a change in the Freedom of Information Act. And essentially, it excludes the premier, his office, the cabinet, their offices, parliamentary assistants, their offices, which probably accounts for just about every Tory MPP at Queen's Park, exempt for FOI requests, Freedom of Information requests. We all know, based on the stories we've done and the conversations we've had over the last year or more, how vital and how often FOIs come up in terms of reporting. Certainly the Trillium Global News, Toronto Star, everybody at the park is dipping into them, and they're finding out what turns into public interest, really important accountability stories. On Monday, the minister was asked, again at an unrelated news conference, about this, and he defended it, and then the premier stepped in.
What we are doing is ensuring cabinet confidentiality. We're aligning with the majority of jurisdictions in the rest of Canada, and we're also ensuring that foreign countries, foreign companies, which have been taking advantage of our openness through predatory information gathering, will no longer be able to. So we will do what it takes to protect the people of Ontario.
Thank you.
I think you're being too politically correct. We got to protect ourselves against the communist Chinese that are infiltrating our country, Canada, the U.S., everything into our education system, into high-tech companies. That's who we have to protect from, too. So it's serious.
Here's the problem, though, Keith. He was talking about the cybersecurity element of the legislation, but was asked about the FOI, and that was where the journalists were coming in on it. So even there, we're muddying the waters in terms of where this is going to go. And you know well, I mean, I talked to Dean Beebe a couple of weeks ago, your former colleague of yours at CP. He was the FOI wizard. And even he today will tell you that the FOI system is cumbersome. It's not evenly applied, et cetera. So now to cut it back even further, this is the problem.
This is all muddying the water even further. The Premier and the Minister intentionally muddying the water, saying reporters want to get at everybody's healthcare records and we'd be digging and trying to get that. First of all, those are already protected. And even if they weren't, that's not something reporters dig into. It might be on a celebrity case, I suppose, or something like that, but that would, again, be very rare exceptions. But we just don't do that. This is all about the Premier trying to defend his use of his personal cell phone for government business. And it boils right down to that. You can talk about the Chinese coming in and all that. Okay, that's something to be dealt with. But bringing in an FOI law retroactively, so does that mean we're going to not hear or find out anything else about the Green Belt, about the Skills Development Fund, about so many things that this government has been dealing with, the housing voice, and the Premier, again, muddying the decisions. You don't need muddying the waters by saying, we'll tell you the decisions. You can FOI the decisions by the government, but not the advice, not the practice, the debates. I'm sorry, we need to know who's advising you to do this. Who's advising you to lock down every school and hospital? Who's advising you to take these actions? We need to know who has the Premier's ear and what they're saying to them. That's why there's a lobbyist registry for this sort of stuff. They've taken this way too far, and using the cover up, we're just doing what the feds are doing. Well, the feds are the terrible FOI system, as Team Beebe rightly reported. This is not good. This is the opposite of open and transparent. They know it, and they're intentionally, as I say, muddying the waters to make it look like they're doing something not just everybody else is doing. No, this is different. Everything that was protected would have remained protected. This is about them protecting themselves, Premier Ford protecting him and his ministers from their debates and their actions.
Tim, this is one of those things where now, with everything else that's going on this week, this appears to be the reason why he's, out talking about absolutely everything else, trying to distract from, because there doesn't seem to be good justification. This is not necessarily modernizing anything or making anything more transparent or accessible in terms of how government runs.
Well, I'll get to the substance of that, but I don't buy the conspiracy theory, right? The fact that Premier Ford goes on to various issues that may not be the subject of the day, I think is a feature, not a bug. It's his nature, and reporters can ask whatever they want to, and he'll respond, and they decide what to cover, right? So I don't buy that there was a intentional effort to throw a whole bunch of shrapnel out there to disguise. However, on the issue itself, I remember. 3 comments on this. One experience with FOIs, and it's been some time since I was, an FOI request back in government. So I don't know how much it's evolved, and if there are excesses that need to be curbed. But I remember, famously when I was in government, and Sandra Pupatella grilled one of our MPPs, tourism minister then Cam Jackson, and folks might remember that over his expenses, hotel bills, travel, what were purchased on the taxpayer's dollar. And the famous scene of him, sort of hustling out of question period down the back stairs with cameras in tow. And then the resignation came shortly thereafter. It does shine a very important spotlight on how governments of any stripe spend taxpayer dollars. I'm on the board of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, who have taken issue with this because they regularly FOI things around how government spends money and effectiveness. And then I use that when in opposition quite effectively. I think my team and FOIing around the closure of the gas plant in Mississauga and the decision making behind that, how much money was spent, which I think, effectively you shine a light on how government spends money and decisions are made. And if you're in darkness, bad things can happen. Third comment too, David, having been on both sides of the house, I do lament that over time, governments of all 3 colors have successfully and successively reduced the ability of the opposition to hold the government to account. And that may feel good when you're on the government side, but boy, it comes back to bite you when you're on the opposition side. And things that reduce the chance to ask questions, to do good committee work, to get information on how money is spent, that's just healthy for democracy ultimately. And we seem to be heading in the wrong direction, government after government.
So let me ask you this then, Tim. Given the tendency of the premier to come back and say, okay, maybe I went too far. Is this one of those times where are we going to see him dial this back? Because the pressure is going to come from a lot of corners, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how much pressure is brought forward, and what it focuses in on. I've got a bit of a different perspective than Keith. I'd be curious Premier Wynne says about this. Like, I do think that when recommendations are given to cabinet or cabinet ministers on options to solve a problem, I do think that's important to protect because sometimes you got to look at radical options, or you get a whole scale, and some were never considered. But I think it might actually, if that is fully FOIable, I think that actually may limit the amount of options that you look at and the depth of thinking you may do around issues. But the areas that I mentioned otherwise, I just think that is a healthy way to scrutinize how any elected member spends funds. We'll see what the opposition does. I guess both the New Democrats and the Liberals have said they would restore these changes. Let's see if they press it in the House next week.
Yeah, Kathleen Wynne, the idea that somehow just if there's any sense that you just fill out the form and you get what you want, that's not how it works either,
No,
right? I mean, there's all kinds of
not at
redactions,
all.
and it's subjective in terms of what's redacted. There isn't really clear criteria that is standardized from one request to the other. Keith and I could make the same request and come back with two different reports.
Yeah, I mean it's already a challenging process for people who want to go through an FOI. I mean, you guys know, having been reporters, you know what that's like. You don't get all the information necessarily, and Tim, there already are protections in place for cabinet documents. So it's not like you get a full binder of chapter and verse of everything that happened in a cabinet meeting. So I think those protections are already there. Having been in government at the time of the gas plant conversation, if I can call it that, I know scandals, conversations, interrogations, whatever you want to call it, that whole issue. I mean, I am surprised that there aren't people saying to the premier, we're going to want this. Like, we're not going to be in government forever. And at some point, the Conservative Party of Ontario, the PC Party of Ontario, is going to want to have the ability to request freedom of information on issues that the government of the day is dealing with. So I think incredibly short-sighted. I really believe, especially because of the retroactivity, I really believe that this is about the personal calls on the premier's phone, because he doesn't, as I understand it, he doesn't carry two phones. So I don't think of it as a conspiracy theory. I think that they don't want that stuff to come out into the public realm. So they're putting this law. They're saying they're going to put this law in place and make it retroactive, which is kind of outrageous, actually, when there already are requests in about these things. So I think this is one that's going to be very hard for him to justify. Dave, wouldn't be surprised if he walks it back, because I think there are going to be a lot of people who even are his allies who are going to say this is not a good idea. And I don't know, in the context of all the other things that are going on, he seems really worked up about something. I don't know if he's mad. The energy in his voice when he talks about the protesters and the home invaders, he seems really agitated. So who knows? Maybe it's just all the stuff that he has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's a really hard job. A lot of stuff comes at you every minute. But he seems really without any guardrails right now. And I think this one is really a bridge too far.
Well, John, we look at this and we'll be accused in the media of whining about it because we're the ones affected, and the opposition will whine about it because they're the ones affected. But, how do the people in Eganville actually feel? And we know you have your finger on the pulse there. So what, beyond the inner circle around Queen's Park, does this matter?
I don't think it matters today because there's other things to do. But let me say a couple of things on this. Ontario is going to create a freedom of information situation, which is unlike any other province. I mean, it's not just about cabinet and and ministers where in other places you can ask about freedom of information and within that box be turned down or given or granted access. They're now saying we want to take all of that, including our political staff and anyone associated with that, and all of their emails and all of their information, and put it outside of that. Okay, so it's removing it and putting it in a lead box outside of the system. So there are a couple of things that come to mind on, and making it retroactive so you can't find out what's gone before it. So there are a couple of things that come to mind. When does this matter? Well, it matters in terms of the characterization of the government. And we've looked today and say, look, the Conservatives are doing well in the polls. He's in a majority government, so nothing's going to change. I mean, if he wants to do this, he can. No question about it. But will it come back to frame the government at a time when there is an election as to part of how voters see the government, how that campaign's created, and then you get a choice. Okay, so that's one part of it. The other part, though, is that there's going to be legal challenges to this. No question. This is a matter which is a fundamental tenet of freedom of expression under the Charter in gaining information about what is going on in government, and sets a unique precedent. So I suspect that the can of worms that has been opened by doing what is going to be done is going to end up with a legal challenge which will work its way up all the way to the Supreme Court. I don't doubt that at all, because this is going to be a matter of quasi-constitutional government lawmaking, and it's going to reflect on what all governments can keep, hide, or deal with. I mean, this is something that you're going to have a lineup of people who want to get information and say that this is now boxing us out completely from that line of information. So I guess I say the following three things. Number one, I don't think people in Eganville really care about this. They've got other things that are important. Number two, the government's in a majority situation where it can get away with this. They can do what it wants. But the appeal process to this is going to be legal and constitutional, and it's going to work its way through the process. And as a result of what Ontario has done, because they are very different, now that they're setting it up, will affect all other governments across this country. So that'll be kind of where this is decided, not necessarily in the court of public domain, but it's going to be in the court process for sure.
But
he's already lost two court rulings on this, right? He's already lost two court
Yeah,
rulings on his phones. So, I mean, we know that's where it's headed. I mean, the court said that he shouldn't be conducting, same as the Information and Privacy Commission, you shouldn't be conducting government business on your personal phone. He's just vowing, that law doesn't apply to me. It's insanity.
Well, John,
it's not that hard to carry two phones, honestly.
Right.
It's not that big a challenge.
Back to your point, John, just in terms of, the process, and I get it in terms of how it's all going to play out. We're talking about years now. What this does for me and where it matters is that it instills a level of cynicism in the general public about, oh, Jesus, these guys again, right? And it's not just Ford, it's politicians in general. We're already seeing a lack of engagement in terms of voters, in terms of general elections. Voter turnout is down. I just think this kind of thing lends itself to that malaise generally.
Well, yeah, I've been polling on this now for a long, long time, and one of the best polls and most fun polls you do is respected professions. And if it weren't for car salesmen, politicians would be at the bottom of the list. And I say that because I know the answers to it. So, things are not going to change in that department. What I think you're alluding to is something different, and it's more structural. And that is, and we can talk about the other issues which happened this week, and that is, we've always been cynical about how politicians deal with things. Okay, so put that aside for a minute. But what we're dealing here is with the structure of government and administration. We live in a country which was founded on peace, order, and good government. And the order of it is critical. And so whether you're, producing an OPP, Metropolitan Toronto Police report, which is outside the judicial stream and raises a whole series of questions about the jurisprudence of that jurisdiction, all that stuff that's just happened in Toronto, or whether you're talking about now shielding the public from certain information, which heretofore has been brought, before the courts, and you're now, as Keith raised, it's kind of like, who enforces it? There's another issue going on here, and that is Doug Ford is on about a whole series of legal issues and how the courts deal with individuals. And we're also now looking at how the courts may interpret how the cabinet and freedom of information is applied. What we're really talking about here is the role of the courts and how it's going to do its job, because we can pass judgment on this government in the next election, no question. But the issue now is really, as we're seeing south of the border, the national security advisor on counterterrorism resigns one day and is now being investigated by the FBI in the next. We see decisions made south of the border by the Supreme Court, and then they are maligned as a result of it. And effectively, Donald Trump saying, "Yeah, you and whose army?" The court system itself is being challenged, and I think that's where the more important issue is: peace, order, and good government. We get a chance to change good government or bad government every 4 years. It's the order proposition that I think is under challenge right today.
The whole question of the courts came front and center this week. Probably not the way we would have expected, Tim, with the OPP report on the conduct of Toronto Police Service officers involved in the Zameer trial. And the OPP report exonerated the police in terms of their testimony, et cetera. I don't necessarily want to get into that because I think it's been litigated, and I'm not sure there's a real satisfactory end in that conversation. But the question around whether or not the judge should apologize, I think, is, to John's point, is an important one. And I get why the Toronto Police, the association head is saying he wants the judge to apologize. I might even accept that the police chief might be saying that. But I think it's a problem when the premier steps out and insists that the judge in this case apologize for her charge to the jury based on the evidence that was presented in that court.
Yeah, I don't agree. Look, I'd love to learn more about this. I think it's a fascinating story, and I think it illustrates at its core that when it comes to policing, things can happen so fast, and you could actually have different competing interpretations of what went down. And I think Chief Demeke did the right thing by having an outside police force come in and investigate. I think that the president of the Toronto Police Association, Clayton Campbell, is doing an excellent job and standing up so no surprise that he called for an apology for the judge, because I think she had demanded the same. And this is perfectly consistent with Doug Ford's positioning. He is running against the judge's party, using that Doug Ford humor. He talks about the judges with their gowns and gavels, running for elected office because they cross the line. I think he's got a bit of a case here. Did the judge go too far in sort of making this proclamation from the bench or not? Do I think the judge has to apologize?
I just think the premier putting his thumb on the scale in this is different than Clayton Campbell, Tim. It's a different lane. I mean, we're complaining about the judge being out of her lane. I think the premier's way out of his lane on this.
Yeah, this is a lane well trod by Premier Ford, right? Calling out judges who make the case that they legislate from the bench, that they extend, they torture the Charter of Rights and Freedoms beyond recognition to stop government actions that aren't reflected, in the Charter. He certainly called out judges consistently for giving low sentences. There's a risk now that more judges will simply not incarcerate people because of conditions of jails. No, I disagree. This is very much within the Doug Ford universe and a consistent message from Premier Ford. Will the average person think the judge should apologize? Maybe, but I think a lot of them would actually, in their own scales of justice, probably side with the cops more than the judge.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Kathleen.
can I just jump in, because I just think that the undermining of the judiciary. Yeah, I agree, Tim. This is his lane. He has worked to undermine the judiciary. He doesn't like that courts have any power. He doesn't, he has not hesitated to use the notwithstanding clause. He wants to be able to rule with an iron fist. That's what he wants to be able to do. And I think it's incredibly dangerous. So people hearing the premier calling out a judge and saying that she should apologize, what I think people could take from that is, the premier has the right to question the judiciary if he doesn't like a decision, and that's why he's doing it. He didn't like the decision, and so he gets to call it out. He doesn't have all the information. He's not a lawyer. He's not a judge. He doesn't know all of the background information, and he hasn't poured over all the evidence that she did. So I just think that this is incredibly dangerous, and I don't think it should cross the mind of any premier, anyone in that chair, to undermine the judiciary in that way. You know, if he really thinks that we should have elected judges, then he better make that case in in a rational way, because he hasn't. And I think that there are people across this country who would argue absolutely that is the wrong way to go. So I think he's being, again, it's populist nonsense from the podium that speaks to a certain segment of the population who agree with him that he should have these sort of absolute powers. And it really is a very undermining thing to do in terms of the way our system works. And we talk about order and good government, quickest way to undermine those is to not have a functioning judiciary, have a politicized judiciary, and to not have process. And that's what it seems like that's where he'd like to go. And I just think it's incredibly dangerous. And yeah, it is in his lane. That doesn't mean it's not dangerous.
Keith, the idea that occurred to me as this is all playing out, and we get into this, sort of quagmire of back and forth and opinion on the judge, et cetera, it occurs to me that fundamentally we've got a problem with our justice system generally, whether it's from the time of arrest to bail to investigations to incarceration to the time spent before trial to the number of judges that are needed to get all this thing through. There's no one thing you can point to in the justice system that says that's the problem. There's a problem all the way through there that lends itself to a lot of the problems and the conversation that we had this week around the Toronto Police Service and this particular trial. And again, it doesn't change the outcome of the trial. Let's just be clear about that, whatever went on. But to me, to have the police investigating police, and I know I got the pushback on this saying, well, nobody complained when New York Region Police investigated Toronto Police and it turned into Project South. Completely different thing. They weren't ordered by an authority to say investigate what happened in that case. And I know I'm splitting hairs, but back to John's point around process. Does this not suggest that if we're going to investigate what a police service is doing, that it shouldn't be police? Now, OPP might have done the investigation because of the Reconstructionists, but should it not have been a broader process where that evidence that was brought forward was challenged the same way the evidence that the TPS brought forward in the trial was challenged? I mean, we need to have a level playing field here.
Well, to your point about all the problems in the justice system from the top to the bottom, we don't know what the one solution is, but we know one that's not helping, and that's the premier commenting on verdicts and basically calling into question a verdict. And that's what he's doing here. Are we to believe that this man was wrongfully acquitted? Because that's basically what the premier is saying when he says the judge owes an apology to these police officers. Really? You're basically saying this acquittal was not right by the courts, and you're calling that into question, and then that goes to Premier Wynne's point about undermining the judiciary right across the board. That's not what you're supposed to do. I can't tell you the count of times I wanted to get a premier to comment on a court case, and they just wouldn't. It was their easiest out. It was their best out forever. We can't comment. It's before the courts. It was a standard reply. We were so used to it that we expected it. And so when Premier Ford clearly just tossed that out the window, and he's been, very free about commenting on judges, it's a fine line. It's one thing to comment on sentencing and on parole and these sorts of things, but to comment specifically on judges and saying this one owes an apology is a bit too far. To your point about police investigating police, wrong. Again, what did we get from the OPP? We didn't get that they compared this and that. We got their conclusions. And their conclusions were that these 3 undercover officers didn't lie. Okay, how do we know? Well, all we have is your conclusions. We need an independent inquiry, a public inquiry. Police investigating police, as we know, never works. Not to the public's confidence anyway. It might work to the confidence of the police. But this one, it just calls into question the OPP's actions here. Why haven't we seen more of what you compared? Why haven't we seen how you reached this conclusion? And for the premier to just jump on this and say that the judge owes an apology is clearly 5 steps too far, not just one. I mean, he's just way over the line here, and I disagree with Tim on this completely. The premier should not be making these comments. Straight up.
I'm really lucky that I had the parents I had, and that is that they really instilled within us, in the family, a sense of what's important is justice and the process for this. I was a founding member and served on the board for Reuben Carter's Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted for 10 years. And during that time, a lot of innocent people had their cases reviewed and were let go. And in the years that followed, of course, we had James Locklear, who still is very involved, and it's now called Innocence Canada, and it gets millions of dollars of funding every year to go through and review judicial decisions. Okay, so I have a bias when I come to this stuff, and I raised it a minute ago, and now you'll see where I'm coming from. There can be competing decisions, but there can only be one arena. The Premier may say what he wishes, but to conduct a police-on-police investigation, which I thought was going to be more about the conduct of collusion and whether or not they had shared notes and didn't do a proper process within the police situation, to a point where now what we have is a competing narrative without all of the people who were either investigated, including the driver of the vehicle, plus cross-examination for whatever quasi-evidence you want to bring into the process, is a significant miscarriage. There can be appeals within judicial conduct in terms of what people say within the judiciary. You want to find out whether or not this thing can be challenged? Go ahead, fill your boots. Get 3 judges to take a look at what the judge says and whether it was right or wrong. But man, I step back from this and say, this is not just about something where, we're all concerned about the families of police officers, the conduct of the police, the victims, the reconstruction, all of that sort of stuff. I'm more concerned about what happens when the police or somebody says, you know what, I don't agree with what that person who was proven to be innocent, or actually it's not guilty. Let's just reconstruct things and see how they turn out on our side of the ledger. I'm deeply concerned that this is now being taken out of the court's hands. The court can't respond to this. The judge can't respond to it. You've got, decisions and everybody now laying onto the judicial system. And that is the core of what we hold to here. As I said, I'm looking across to the United States, and all of us can see what's going on down in the United States. The one thing that holds our society together, and there is fault for the judicial system for sure, but if we start putting in competing arenas of evidence and outcome and judging in that way and leaving it in the public domain, you know what creeps in? Complete cynicism, complete undermining of our judiciary process.
Exactly.
We don't elect judges. And frankly, last time I checked, if you have more jail space, then you can put more people in it if you want. But if you have none and people are 3 deep in a cell, where do you put people? So I think there's a big divide between what arena decisions are made in and how they can be brought to bear, and criticism of the judicial process. But I don't see this as right when you have competing arenas where the rule of law and prosecution and defense can't be applied and are not applied. We could only rely on one judiciary, one courtroom, and one set of laws which say this is how it is. The evidence is weighed, brought forward, and decided upon. Otherwise, it's free game on everybody's life, not just this case.
So, Tim, we've spent 44 minutes here. We've talked about the FOI. We've talked about the polls. We've talked about the OPP investigating Toronto Police Service. And only now are we getting to the idea that the Premier is encouraging a guy in Vaughan. He should have probably shot a home invader more than he already did when the guy was fleeing from the scene of a home invasion. I'm more than a little disturbed by that. I realize it sounds funny, but at the same time, and I grew up in a house with, lawfully owned and stored guns. I get it, but I can't ever think of that my dad would have been the guy chasing somebody down the street with a loaded gun, let alone firing it at him.
Man, I felt like taking a swing of the baseball bat when folks invaded our property, could have threatened my family, stole our vehicles. When we heard about neighbor's daughter sitting at the dining room table trying to do her homework and some jackass breaks into the house, right? You defend your family, you defend your property. I've got no problem with what the Premier said. Look, I'll be the voice of opposition on this panel, proudly so. Look, I think that Toronto Police Chief Demakew did the right thing as officers, and in so doing, potentially police as a whole in Toronto were accused of colluding, of lying, of lining up their stories. There was accusations that they didn't do the proper process to reconstruct the scene. I think it's important to investigate that. It's not a judicial process, but it's one to say, okay, are we making mistakes here? What happened? And improve. So I think you made the right call. But look, on the issue of the justices as a whole, boy, I could be wrong. It just reminds me of an earlier time in the mid-late 70s, right, where there's a feeling that court system wasn't working. People were out too easily. That people were feeling unsafe in their communities. It feels like it's there again. And I don't think Premier Ford's motivation here, because I share a lot of it, is about seizing absolute power. I think it's about rebalancing. I think he's sincerely concerned on two things. Judges are too soft on crime. It's making communities dangerous. And I think Davy's also concerned that the deal made in 1982 with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our Constitution Act has been violated. The judges have increasingly broken those bounds, taken authority away from legislatures. I don't think those that signed in 1982 ever thought there'd be a constitutional right to a bike lane, for goodness sakes. That basically said the governments couldn't freeze wages so we could keep spending under control, that you couldn't move the homeless out of a park until you built enough housing. Like these are rights at the end of the day. So I think the Premier is rightly responding to both those issues, is emotional about it, because I think a lot of people are.
Well, let me just go back to the home invasion just for a second, and I think there's a distinction between you swinging a baseball bat at some guy coming into your house because your kids are in the room, because I would do the same thing, than you chasing a guy down the street with a gun as he's leaving the property and firing it on a residential street. I just think that two completely different things. When I'm shooting at a guy who's running away, I'm not defending my house. I'm not defending myself.
It's an emotional response. It's not advice to go starting shooting people. But that the Premier is speaking to the frustration and the anger and the concern that Ontarians have, and rightly so. I don't think people view this as literally prescription to go out and do this, but to say, yeah, are people worried about this and they should have a right to defend their homes? I think people say they're right.
But look at this continuum. We've got the Premier standing up and basically undermining a judge's decision or judge's comments. You've got the same Premier saying, you should have shot him more than once, shoot him again, which is, there's an aspect of vigilantism to that I think is really frightening. And Tim, I completely sympathize with the baseball bat, I mean, absolutely. You're going to protect your home. I get that. But gratuitous violence, which is what the Premier is basically saying, you shoot him once, we'll shoot him again. You would have shot him a few times. And I couldn't find the quote this morning. I was looking for it. But in one of the passages, the Premier says, these guys invading, and he talks about protesters. He throws protesters into the list. So I think there's an agitation about people who just don't agree, or people who are acting in a way that he doesn't approve of, and he wants to punish them. So that really worries me, that vigilantism sort of aspect. And then there's the pepper spray, and we're going to give women he all of a sudden is all concerned about women and their safety and walking in underground parking lots, and as if that hasn't been an issue for 50 years. I mean, I don't walk in underground parking lots by myself, never have, because that's been an issue forever. But giving me pepper spray is not going to solve the problem. So I think that there's an aspect of you're on your own because the judiciary doesn't work, and you need a gun and you need pepper spray because the world is falling apart. Well, what I say to that is, let's make sure that kids get an education. And I'm sorry, I know that I'm going to sound like a bleeding heart liberal in terms of the root causes, but we know when there was zero tolerance in our schools, that policy that expelled kids, we know that there were kids on the street who needed support. And when we came into office, we put in place supports in the school, kept more kids in school, and they were then not on the street being violent. So I would say to the Premier, let's look at what you're doing to actually prevent these actions in the first place. If we're seeing increased crime, which, the overall crime statistics are down, but if we're seeing certain kinds of crime, then let's deal with those, rather than telling me that I'm on my own, I got to have pepper spray because I have to take the law into my own hands, which is, I fear, the message from the Premier.
Well, John, to that point now, and to go back, what we do know about the suspects is that they were gang-related. They were involved in other home invasions. To me, the answer is not shoot them again. Again, I shouldn't laugh at this, but that shouldn't be the answer. The answer should be, we need to figure out how we crack the gangs. We need to figure out how we stop the home invasions. Is that the answer?
Well, I think a few things can be true at the same time. Number one is that the premier is voicing the frustration of many people and concerns that they would have if somebody broke into their house and continued to do so. We can then also look at how governments have failed to recognize what the real issue is going on here, and that is that we don't have enough judges. And you could say, oh, we don't need more judges. Well, we do need more judges because we have a whole series of crimes that, in fact, are being dismissed before the courts because we don't have them. We also don't have enough space to put people. And as a result, you can't just keep putting people. This is not 1891 England where you can just throw people in jail and let them rot. I mean, we do have, we have no place. And we have no jails being built. We have no place for them to be put. I mean, we're kind of constructing our own problems here. It seems to me, though, that the whole aspect of civility is kind of lost on us nowadays. I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to say to people that they should keep a shotgun in their house? That this is the way in which we're going to have this now? That legal gun owners, this guy had a shotgun. How many of us have a shotgun in our house? And that you can be standing there waiting for somebody to come in through the door and pull the trigger on them? Okay, so is that what we're leading to, as opposed to having a proper way in which we detain, investigate, decide upon, punish, and do all this sort of stuff, as well as in, make sure that we're not getting more guns in over the border and the drugs and the carjackings are all looked after. I mean, I kind of remember the days, and maybe I'm just sounding stupidly old, but where politicians were really careful about what they said about the law. And by simply saying, look, you know what, these stupid judges don't know what the F they're talking about. You should be able to have a shotgun beside your bed. And if anybody breaks in, pull the trigger. And don't just pull it once, pull it a few times so that you catch not one but five of these guys. This is the chief. This is the person who's running the show. And this is where I'm really concerned. Again, I get very passionate about the law and the courtroom and the process. And you can say things that I would support that are critical of the courts. No question about that. But when you are suddenly now into the other area, whether it's in Kensington Market and somebody runs after somebody or somebody's breaking into your house, and you're now we're having a discussion of whether or not you should hit him with a baseball bat versus shoot him more than once with a shotgun, I think we've gone down the wrong road here. So the political process is one thing to talk about, but I don't want to go and buy a shotgun and leave it by my bedside at night. And that's where I think this is where things get encouraged, and that's not where I want Ontario to be.
All right. Well, let's leave it there, shall we? This has been On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Thanks to Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, Kathleen Wynne, John Wright. I'm Dave Trafford. Just a reminder, if you're following us on YouTube or any one of the podcast platforms, make sure you hit the follow button and the notifications will land in your inbox and you'll know what's going on. You won't miss a thing. And guess what? We've been busy, had lots to talk about. Next week, they get back to business. Legislature's back in session. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. Enjoy your weekend.